So it falls to me to articulate a positive vision of the human future. I don't know if I can do that, but I think I can talk about what the prologue has to be to a positive human future. I don't think we can have one unless we envision it. So what I'm going to do is talk about what is positive psychology, what is well-being, and positive interventions that build these things. And finally, I want to talk about the relationship of flourishing in individuals to nations to corporations. So let's start with what is positive psychology. Where I came from and where psychology came from, I came from working on misery. I spent my life working on helplessness, depression, suicide. As Jim mentioned, when I became president of my association, I looked around over a decade ago and asked, what do psychologists do well? And we do misery and suffering well. And what don't we do at all? We don't ask what makes life worth living, and can there be a science of the positive side of life? So my mission for the last 12 years has been to shepherd the science, the funding, the practice, the possibility that there could be a rigorous science and a useful practice of what makes life worth living. So that's what the next 18 minutes are about. And in this view, it says that positive psychology should be just as concerned with human strength as it is with weakness, to quantify it and to ask how to build it. It should be just as interested in making what is best in life as with repairing pathology. It should be just as concerned with your lives and the lives of your children as it is with people in great trouble. And by the way, I don't mean this as a displacement of social science as usual, but rather as a supplement. And finally, psychology and psychiatry have to develop interventions not just to decrease suffering, but to increase well-being and flourishing. And it turns out that's different. As you probably know, Schopenhauer and Freud both believed the best we could ever do was to minimize our misery. I think that's profoundly incorrect. And I'll talk about evidence against that. We want to reduce misery, but we want to build flourishing. So, what is well-being in this model? Well, in this model, there's an acronym for it, PERMA. The claim, and in many ways Ted Turner gave my speech, and it falls to me to say what he might mean and how if one can't afford dire pessimism, what are the elements that one should think about in building? So PERMA says there are 4 components, each one of which is measurable, and each one of which there is reason to think is buildable. The first is positive emotion, what's generally called happiness, the subjective hedonics of life. The second is positive relationships. The third is meaning and purpose in life, and the fourth is accomplishment. So flourishing, from my point of view, asks the question, how do you measure those things with rigor? How do you measure them in individuals? How do you measure them in nations? How can you measure them globally? And ask how to build them. What do we know about the building of these matters? So there's too short a time to take you through the science underlying this, but what I'll do is take you through just 3 representative kinds of scientific endeavors that people in positive psychology do. And I'll do it for individuals, since that's mostly what I've spent my life working on. So I spent a lot of time, 40 years ago, I discovered a phenomenon called learned helplessness. And that was basically that when animals and people confront events that they can't control, they collapse. They become passive, they become stupid, their brain changes, they become more susceptible to illness and the like. And research on this went on for about 15 years, probably about 1,000 articles in the literature on the phenomenon. But what no one ever pointed out is when I brought people and animals to my laboratory and I gave them unsolvable problems, inescapable noise, only about 2/3 of them became helpless. 1/3 I could not make helpless. So I asked the question, what was it about the third of you who, even though you face adversity, allows you to bounce back and not become helpless? So a field grew up called learned optimism, in what people looked at is before going to the laboratory or before a divorce, what's your theory of setbacks in life? And it turned out those people who believed that setbacks in life were temporary as opposed to permanent, were controllable as opposed to uncontrollable, and were local. You know, I'm just bad at math, I'm not stupid, rather than pervasive. That was the third who never became helpless. So it's kind of I'm going to do optimism for all three examples. So we now have a pretty good handle on picking out in advance people who don't become helpless. So we then went on to ask in high-level athletics, could you predict what athletes were going to do after defeat? So we took our whole 1988 Olympic swimming team. And by the way, the reason it's important to do it in athletics and in swimming in particular, the relay events follow the individual events. And so if a great swimmer does badly, you want to know whether or not he's going to be deflated or inflated, whether or not to put him in the relays. So what we did is, here's what we did with Matt Biondi. We did it with all of the swimmers. The coach said, Matt, into the pool, swim the 100 fly. Biondi swam it in 50.1. He came out and Nort said, 52.5, terrible time. Rest up for 20 minutes and swim it again. Biondi's in the upper quartile of optimism and the way I defined it. It's temporary, it's local, and it's controllable. He swam it the second time in 49.9. So what we find in general in Major League Baseball, in basketball, in Olympic swimming, is that the optimists get better after defeat, and the pessimist gets slower. So that's a second kind of study that emerges from the literature. A third kind is physical health itself, and there's looking around how male and what your age is, most of you are going to die of cardiovascular stuff. And so we're quite interested in quantifying risk factors for cardiovascular death. So so we measure cholesterol, blood pressure, all the usual risk factors, but we also measure optimism. And you statistically can hold traditional risk factors constant and quantify what is the effect of optimism relative to other risk factors. So in a recent study of 1,000 Dutch 65-year-olds, we measured all these things. We followed them for 10 years. 350 died of cardiovascular stuff. Holding constant all traditional risk factors, the upper quartile of Ted Turnerisms in optimism has 1/4 the risk of cardiovascular death of the rest of the population. And this has been replicated quite a number of times, and we're fascinated by the cardiovascular mechanisms that might produce that. So those are three examples of the kind of thing the science does. So less depression, more achievement, particularly under adversity, better physical health, are three well-documented consequences of optimism. So in the well-being formulation, PERMA basically says what we want to measure rigorously and then intervene on if we can, and what a positive human future is about, is this question of building well-being. Building positive emotion, building positive relationships, building meaning and purpose, and building accomplishment. So, are these things like your waistline? I'm going to offend some of you. There's a $50 billion American dieting industry. It's a scam. The reason it's a scam is that any of you can lose 5% of your body weight in about 3 weeks by following any diet on the bestseller list. I did the watermelon diet and lost 20 pounds. I had diarrhea for a month. The problem is 85 to 95% of people regain all that weight or more in the next 3 to 5 years. So the question about interventions is whether or not building positive emotion, relationships, meaning, accomplishment is like dieting, boosterism, or you get back. So let me take you through the kind of things people who do intervention in this area. I'm a naughty thumb of science person. I spent a lot of my life testing drugs and psychotherapies in random assignment placebo-controlled tests. And so when I started working on the positive side of life, I began to say, well, can you ask what makes people happier in random assignment placebo-controlled testing? And from the Buddha to modern pop psychology, there have been about 200 suggestions about what makes people flourish. So a lot of what we do is we take those suggestions, we put them on the web, we do random assignment placebo-controlled. We found about 12 to 18 of them actually seem to lastingly increase these variables. And so let me see. So with individuals, here's an example of something that lasts if you put it on the web with no human hands. If this was, I think you're getting a copy of my book, Authentic Happiness, so you can actually do this. In that book, there's something called signature strengths tests, which asks kindness, fairness, gratitude, what are your highest strengths? So we have people take the signature strengths tests, and then we say, okay, take something you have to do at work every week that you don't like doing, and figure out how to do that tedious task using your highest strength. So, for example, one of the people I worked with was a bagger at the Acme, and she hated bagging, and her highest strength was social intelligence. So what she had to do was to figure out a way to bag using social intelligence. So she resolved to make the encounter with her the social highlight of every customer's day. Now notice she failed at this all the time, but she put what was best in her on offer all the time. Well, basically when you do random assignment placebo-controlled tests of that, you find people who do this 6 months later are less depressed and happier. So that's the kind of individual thing we do. For the last decade, we've been taking these 12 to 18 techniques, none of which are terribly hard to do, to schools around the world, and we train teachers in these principles and techniques, and then we measure for the next couple of years versus controls the depression, the happiness, the anxiety, the conduct of their students. And basically we found in 21 replications around the world that when you teach teachers these techniques of positive education, that the students are less depressed, less anxious, and have better conduct. I found myself, to my great surprise, at the Pentagon 2 years ago with the Chief of Staff, and he said to me, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, divorce, substance abuse, depression, what does positive psychology say about that, Dr. Selligman? And I said, sir, the reaction, post-traumatic stress disorder is a particularly nasty combination of anxiety and depression. And the reaction of human beings to extreme adversity is Gaussian. And on the left-hand side, you have people who fall apart. And I understand you're spending $10 billion a year treating them, and you should continue to do that. In the middle, you have resilience, and that's most people. And what that means operationally is that people go through a very hard time, but 3 months later, by psychological and physical measures, they're back where they were. And then most interestingly, there's this huge group on the right-hand side that Nietzsche was right about. If it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. These are people who show post-traumatic growth. people who, by our measures a year later, after going through terrible times, by physical and psychological measures, are stronger. Whereupon I watched something I've never seen in my life happen. Unlike you, General Casey ordered that from this day forward, positive psychology and resilience will be taught in the entire United States Army and measured. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years. Every month, and he said to me, you know, the general staff has read your stuff about teachers. We see you teach teachers, you measure the students. That's the Army model. I said, it is? He said, yeah, we have 40,000 teachers in the Army. I said, you do? He said, yeah, the drill sergeants. So your job, Marty, will be to take all 40,000 drill sergeants and teach them. So every month now, 150 drill sergeants come to the University of Pennsylvania for 10 days, and we take them through a course on flourishing and these principles. This is a work in progress, but it's the most important work I've ever been involved in. Flourishing in individuals, flourishing in schools, can you make the Army flourish? How about nations? Does it make any sense to ask, and this is where we're starting to talk about a positive human future, usually when we measure nations, when we measure GDP or unemployment or illness statistics, we're measuring what's wrong. Now, if you're following what I'm saying that the downstream effects of flourishing not only involve more positive emotion, better relations, more meaning, more accomplishment, but it turns out people who are flourishing are more productive at work, they're physically healthier, and they're at peace. And so there is the beginning, both in France and the UK, of the measurement of flourishing by entire nations. So this is a new study by Felicia Huppert of the Wellbeing Institute at Cambridge. What she does is ask the kinds of questions we look at. 2,000 people in each of 23 European Union nations. And what you can see here is 33% of Danish adults are flourishing by the criteria I'm talking about. 18% of Brits and 6% of Russians. We believe it's measurable. The measure, you know, you have measurement errors and the like, but the measurement of these dependent variables is becoming more and more sophisticated. So one wants to ask the question, and I know David Cameron and Sarkozy both take this seriously, particularly if your economy, if the best you can do in leading a nation is to stop the hemorrhaging economically, will that get you reelected? Well, I don't think so. But if you change the nature of the game, so what government is about is the increase in well-being of a nation, then you might ask the question, does the policy you institute increase well-being as well as does it increase economics? So that's what's going on nationally. And the moonshot of this. So, and this is why I'm excited to talk to a powerful group like this. So I've argued that when individuals are flourishing, when they have positive emotion, engagement, meaning, good relationships, and accomplishment, that health problems are less, and aggression is less, and productivity is higher. So imagine 51%, that in the year 2051, 51% of the world's population will be flourishing. So that's the moonshot of this, and sort of let me conclude with some thoughts about that. So this says that by measures of positive emotion, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, is it possible that in 40 years, half the world's population can be flourishing? So what is the relationship of that to the technology that you are the leaders of? Well, one of the fascinating things we were talking about this morning with Google Earth is given that it turns out every positive emotion, relationships, meaning, accomplishment all have a lexicon. It Turns out there are 80 positive emotion words, and there are about 80 positive relation words. So if you think about what's going out every moment on the web is words, you can actually measure the lexicon, the use of these words. So you can do mapping onto Google Earth and using time scale and looking at events, you can ask the question, to what extent does flourishing, how much flourishing is there in the world? How quickly does positive emotion damp after the Phillies win the World Series? If you're mapping this locally over time, how quickly does hate damp? So you can actually ask the question globally, how flourishing is a city, a nation at any given moment? And so I believe that is an important possibility here. And very importantly, public policy follows from what you measure. And what we've measured in public policy for more than 100 years is GDP and unemployment. And so that's what policy is driven around. But if you believe, as I do, Jim, that what is GDP for? So one possible answer to that, GDP is a surrogate variable for human flourishing. On that grounds, you say, well, let's measure the real thing and ask the extent to which public policy changes human flourishing. And another great possibility is actually viral gaming. That is, most of our gaming is shoot-'em-up games now. But there is reason to believe that you can use the principles of shoot-'em-up games to build strength and to become the grand master of positive relationships and the like. And indeed, there are gamers who work on this. So the final thing I want to say is I've said that there is good reason to think that when individuals are flourishing, you can measure it, and that when they're flourishing, health problems are fewer, they're more productive and the like. The same may be true of nations. What is a flourishing corporation? So individual is flourishing if PERMA is large. A nation is flourishing if PERMA is large. Can we expand the definition of what the bottom line is? So I know all of you will be forever tied to shareholder equity, but one can also ask, in the same way one asks of GDP, to what extent is this corporation increasing positive emotion in the people who work for it? How good are the relationships? And you can quantify that. How much meaning do people who work in your corporation have? So on this notion, a flourishing corporation has a different bottom line from the traditional bottom line. It's a combination of achievement, accomplishment, and of flourishing. I want to close by asking historically something about, is this possible? Is this just a nice positive vision that could never take hold in real politique? Florence in 1450, as you know, became enormously wealthy based on Medici banking genius, essentially. And under the leadership of Cosimo the Elder, it asked the question, what should we, Florence was at peace, it was in surplus, it was not in civil turmoil, it was not in famine, not in plague. It asked the question, what should we do with this surplus? And the generals said we should conquer the peninsula. And indeed, Florence could have done that. But what Florence decided to do with its surplus was to invest it in beauty. And they gave us what 200 years later was called the Renaissance. Now, I'm not suggesting that the positive human future is about our taking up sculpture. Rather, what I've tried to define is the elements of a positive human future. I believe the United States and the wealthy nations of the world stand at a Florentine moment, and it is vouchsafed to us to decide that the human future will be about the building in our citizens of positive emotion, of relations, of meaning, and accomplishment. Thank you.